We're about to be joined by someone who I have admired for decades now, Dr. J. Michael Waller. Much of what I know about communism, subversion, espionage, propaganda that goes on in this country by our enemies, I have gotten from reading the works of Dr. J. Michael Waller. Of course, he originally from New Hampshire, attended Boston University. He has quite a resume. He was down in Central America on the right side of Nicaragua with the Contras, the freedom fighters, in the 1980s. He's testified in front of Congress multiple times, been involved with NATO. He has taught officers and non-commissioned officers at the Fort Bragg JFK Special Warfare Center where the Green Berets are trained. He runs the Center for Security Policy, as well as Georgetown Associates. His website is jmichaelwaller.com. I'm now happy to introduce Dr. J. Michael Waller. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Chris. It's good to be with you finally.
Yeah, I've been reading Dr. Waller's work for years, his congressional testimony. It's amazing. And we are really, really lucky to have him because I want him to explain to us because one of his expertise is propaganda by foreign countries and subversion in this country. Explain, Dr. Waller, what China is doing to the American mind, or what they're attempting to do to our political system with their propaganda.
Well, the Chinese government has been doing it for a very long time to us to co-opt our leaders, whether they're liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, to map out our whole political system and figure out how they can manipulate all of our leaders and our thought leaders like entertainment figures and late-night TV and journalists and so forth to make us feel that China is not a threat, that China is a responsible country, that we can trust China and we can trust the Chinese Communist Party, and that we should lay down our defenses. And, oh, by the way, in Massachusetts, Boston's a huge hub of Chinese communist subversion, where you had the really prestigious Harvard professor, the nanobiologist, Dr. Charles Lieber, was just busted in January by the FBI for being part of a Chinese spy ring. He had a secret laboratory in Wuhan, China, the whole time, and never even told the authorities about it. Meanwhile, he's getting Pentagon grants. So China's been trying to lull us into this sense of complacency, while at the same time attacking people like you and me and your listeners who express skepticism about the regime.
We're speaking with Dr. J. Michael Waller about Chinese subversion. He's got a tremendous background. Again, I encourage you to go look him up on the internet and go to his website. The Chinese have done an incredible job right here at Mass Maritime Academy, here at the the Bourne Bridge. They've run the Chinese flag up the flagpole and had the cadets salute it.
Yeah, you see this all over the place. Luckily, in Chinatown in Boston, they still have the old Republic of China flag, where the Communist Party has not really been able to make inroads. They're trying to take over Chinatowns in cities around the country. They did in Washington D.C. They've Mass Maritime. Really, any place that deals in shipping is going to be pro-Beijing. They have to be, or they feel like they have to be, because so much trading goes with China and so much of our shipping industry depends on it. But we've rolled over now for 4 decades, more than 4 decades, and all of a sudden we have a president who's pushing back.
If you could briefly, for the folks at home, explain what the Confucius Institutes are and how they are, because we have them here in Massachusetts, how those are working at universities.
The Confucius Institutes are academic organizations that were set up by the Chinese Communist Party to base themselves in American and Canadian and other universities around the world as academic exchange programs, as a place for scholarly discourse, for visiting scholars from China, ways for Americans and others to learn the Chinese main language, Mandarin, and they've come with a lot of cash. And of course, universities love cash. Having been a grad school professor, I know how much they'll close their eyes to wherever the cash comes from. But in so doing, they have helped change the whole academic debate on China, where you can't have a scholarly discussion anymore where a Confucius Institute is on the campus because we can't offend our Chinese hosts. And it got so bad as a spy recruitment center, these institutes, that the U.S. intelligence community was on the verge of discrediting certain universities in the University of Texas system because they were literally compromising people who were going to go into the intelligence community.
We're speaking with J. Michael Waller about subversion in this country and how it's impacting all of us. Well, explain that for a second, because for years, universities have been used as talent spotting areas. I think of Anna Montes, who became the top Cuban expert in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and turns out the entire time before she even was hired, was already a Cuban asset. Explain how this talent spotting goes on college campuses.
Well, I can tell you from my own experience as a grad student at Boston University, and this was more 30 years ago. In the case of the Chinese, they would bring in scholars from the mainland, and those scholars would set up institutes that would be funded with cash from not directly from China, but from an American company or a wealthy American investor with a lot of money and interests in China. And they would set up this institute for so-called Chinese studies, whether it would be for language or for diplomacy or even science and medicine. And they would make it so that they would immediately stifle any debate on the nature of the Chinese government or the fact that this program might be a danger to American industry or American national security by saying, "Oh, you're just a Chinaphobe. You just don't like foreign people. You have something against Asians." And that would just shut people right up. And this went on for years and years and years. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party officials and the millionaires that they were creating, billionaires even, were sending their students to American universities, which could be a good thing if you had free academic inquiry. But they were paying cash. And, of course, again, the universities loved cash, and they would look the other way about who was paying them the cash. And Chinese students became some of the largest cash payers into the university systems, almost rivaling the federal government here. And so you had these programs build, and the more Chinese faculty you had here who still had a loyalty back to Beijing, and students who were often sent here to spy not just on Chinese students, but to scout and recruit American students and faculty, they had a whole network here to compromise us. And we found that those who went along with what the party line was often got promoted, and those of us who questioned everything they were doing never got to see those positions in business or scholarship or journalism that the ones who went along with the Chinese Communist Party line.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. Now, just to circle back for the folks who are maybe just tuning in, we're speaking with J. Michael Waller, and one of the things I found fascinating about you is, you've been in this fight for a long, long time, and just because I want to ask you a little bit about Venezuela and what's going on in Central America as well, but I do want to just you went down into Nicaragua in the 1980s when freedom was on the line down there, although it's been apparently lost now because Ortega's still in power, which is crazy. But talk a little bit about your experience in the 1980s in Nicaragua as a young man.
Oh, I was a student journalist, undergraduate, and I was going to go to Afghanistan with other journalists to report on the fight against the Soviets there, and somebody said, "Hey, you speak Spanish, why don't you go down with the Contras in Central America who were fighting the communist regime down there in Nicaragua?" So I ended up doing that and ended up going back and forth quite a bit and ended up helping them a lot. And in the process, though, Chris, I found a lot of people from the U.S., and especially Massachusetts, were down there helping the communists. Mm-hmm. It was really startling. I remember this congressional staffer named Jim McGovern, mm-hmm. who was working for Congressman Joe Moakley, and he was using U.S. congressional offices as basically a propaganda and spy outpost for the Sandinista communists.
And, of course, today, for those folks who don't recognize the name, he's the congressman from Worcester, and he's chairman of the House Rules Committee. And at one time, he was working, and I don't think he hasn't stopped, right, working on behalf of the communists.
Oh, no, he loves them. And now, of course, he's promoting this snitch on your neighbor program, just like the East Germans were setting up with his Sandinista friends in Nicaragua. So this is all natural to him. Another guy down there was this. I remember the Contras told me, "Hey, there's this American guy who's 2 meters tall, what should we do? And I just said, just leave them alone. Don't touch any Americans. Don't hurt. Well, it turned out it was Bill de Blasio,
Right.
who's now the mayor of New York City.
Think of that, folks, for a second. It must be like a reunion for some of these folks when they see each other. And it's amazing how many Americans really were down there and have very, very deep ties to these foreign regimes. And they're working on our college campuses now.
Yeah, and they're not only doing propaganda. Where you see people promoting propaganda, especially for the Chinese, they're also part of an intelligence collection and agent recruitment network, part of an espionage network. And Eastern Massachusetts is a huge hub for these Chinese operations, one of the biggest in the United States, because of all the technology and universities and so forth, and banking and insurance and so forth. The Chinese have been very busy there for a very long time working against us.
We're speaking with Dr. J. Michael Waller. So we have a situation here where, as you pointed out at the start of the interview, finally we have a president who's pushing back on the Chinese. And the Chinese don't like it. How involved? And the Chinese would like to get rid of Donald Trump. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you track their propaganda, and you can go to our Center for Security Policy timeline at communistpropaganda.com, and it goes straight to this giant timeline we've been putting together on the pandemic and Chinese propaganda and actions around it. And you can actually trace and click to the original sources how the Chinese propaganda line has evolved from covering everything up to making their Communist Party leader Xi Jinping the hero, to saying that the United States created the virus through the U.S. military and planted it in China, and now it's all Donald Trump's fault. The world pandemic is Donald Trump's fault because China was doing such a good job buying the world extra time until the world could get its act together to fight the pandemic. And if you look at it, I've surveyed the whole U.S. Congress, and I've only found one Democrat member. Now, I'm an independent, so I don't like either party. But only one Democrat member of Congress has actively condemned Chinese disinformation and propaganda about that virus. That was Seth Moulton of South Boston. He lasted 2 days before Nancy Pelosi came down on him, told him to shut up and back off, so he withdrew.
Isn't that amazing?
And instead started calling Trump a racist. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? So if you folks listening, as Dr. Waller pointed out earlier about the influence that the Chinese have in the media, one of the things is all of this condemning of the president when he accurately pointed out that the virus started in China. The media acted like he was saying the earth was flat.
Oh, it was a conspiracy theory. It was paranoia. It was a tinfoil hat thing. They were really blasting him. But if you look, and this is the importance of tracking propaganda, if you look at what a regime like the Chinese regime says and does, and then what it doesn't say, it's like the Sherlock Holmes' dog that didn't bark. You've got these black holes in the propaganda and in their actions. If you look early on, you see the Chinese government issued an official statement saying, we have to improve our security at our labs in Wuhan. It came straight from the party leadership. Well, and that was just for internal party use. It wasn't to tell the rest of the world. But that was the smoking gun right there. They knew it came from one of their labs, while they're not telling the rest of the world a thing. And by the way, Secretary of State Pompeo just said the other day the Chinese government is still not allowing American inspectors into that Wuhan laboratory, even though we had been funding some of the efforts there to improve their security years ago.
It's absolutely amazing. We're speaking with Dr. J. Michael Waller. Again, his website is jmichaelwaller.com, and he's also runs the Center for Security Policy, as well as numerous other organizations that he's involved in. You can find his if you go to the website, you can find his long papers that he's written over the years, his congressional testimony as well. It's all out there. It's quite fascinating. As I've said, he is the foundation for lots of what I know today, because his research is very well documented. Very, very interesting stuff and life-saving, hopefully, for some of us. Now, the Chinese are exploiting this. I notice that they're doing all kinds of things and making big gestures to foreign countries to try to say that they're the saviors, particularly in Europe. How effective have they been, Dr. Waller?
Well, it seemed like they were really effective at first. donating these masks and this other, emergency protective gear, and giving money to the World Health Organization and doing whatever else they were doing, until finally, when you get the Italians and the Czechs and even Nepal, tiny little Nepal that has no allies, it's stuck up against the Chinese border, and they're all saying, we don't want this stuff because it's junk, and they're making us pay for it, and they're pretending that it's aid. So that's all backfiring in the Chinese government's face. And then the fact that it's lying, and so plainly lying, about the origins of the virus in Wuhan, to the point where one of the doctors, she was head of the emergency room at Wuhan Central Hospital, she disappeared 4 weeks ago after having come out and exposed the origins of the virus. She vanished, but the Chinese government kept control of her social media accounts, so they keep sending out fake tweets in her name, but she hasn't been seen since. She's probably gone. And then you have expelling American journalists, making two other citizen journalists from China disappear after they were sending around video of footage in Wuhan. And yes, but when you get to the point where even Amnesty International and the Washington Post end up saying, yeah, China's lying about the origin of the virus and it's repressing people at the same time who are speaking out about it, then you're losing the narrative. So it seemed like China was winning on this narrative, but now I think it's in a strategic defeat.
How connected into these international agencies through the United Nations is China? Particularly, I'm thinking of the WHO and the influence that China has with these groups, which then, of course, when they do parrot the Chinese Communist Party's line, it doesn't sound like it's coming from the Chinese communists. Explain how deep into some of these international organizations the Communist Chinese really are.
Oh, the Chinese have burrowed into these international organizations. They don't fund them very much. You and I fund them. The American taxpayer is the single largest funder of these international organizations. But we haven't taken them seriously since the Reagan years. And we're content to let the Soviets first or the Chinese next take them over. From the inside, through bureaucrats rising up, the bureaucrats end up running the organizations, and then the Chinese government puts out incentives or pressure for other countries to go along and support the Chinese approved person, like this Ethiopian. He likes to call himself doctor. He has a PhD, but he doesn't have an MD, and he claims to be a health professional. Put him in. Now he's non-Chinese, so he's doesn't look like he's parroting the Chinese line, to run the World Health Organization. So it's really the fault of American politicians of all stripes for allowing the Chinese to take over these organizations. But what happens when they do, they keep the Chinese secrets, just like the World Health Organization sat on information that Taiwan had provided last December, that this Wuhan virus was transmittable from person to person. Sat on that information for more than 3 weeks, when we could have contained the pandemic in that period of time. So it's not just the propaganda they're doing, they're actually acting in the Chinese regime's own interest.
We're speaking with Dr. J. Michael Waller. The other thing, just pivoting here from China to Russia, back to the 2016 election, so those of us who've been following espionage and subversion knew that the President of the United States was not really a Russian agent and that it was a ridiculous claim. However, sadly, our own FBI didn't. It's such a sad situation within the top, or was at least within the top ranks of the FBI. Explain, if you can, Dr. Waller, about how it turns out the Russian, that Trump's a Russian agent was actually Russian disinformation, and that everyone fell for it, and even some went along with it knowing otherwise. Explain what really happened there.
That was a case in 2016 where what the Russians like to do now, they have no positive narrative anymore. Not that they really did, but some people did find their narrative positive. All they really can do is just throw crap at everybody and mess things up and disrupt it. So their goal is to cause us to distrust our own institutions. Many of our institutions have really lost the public trust anyway, but many are still good. Or they're at least run by people who are trying to do the right thing. So this was a case of the Russian government trying to cast doubt on the trustworthiness of our institutions. They much preferred Hillary Clinton to win. And this is how you could detect the disinformation. The logic of it. Trump's a wild card. Nobody knows what he's going to get up and say and do, especially back then. He did not have an organized team around him who the Russians knew had psychologically profiled and even financially compromised. And none of that. The Russians don't like unpredictable leaders any more than the Chinese do. Really, any more than any of us do, but especially the Russians and the Chinese. So they were really banking on Hillary Clinton. She was predictable. She was established. Her Clinton Foundation, her family foundation, was taking money from the Kremlin financial interests. She had people around her who were always soft on the Kremlin. So when she came out in 2016 denouncing Russian subversion and saying Donald Trump was a tool of the Russians, that was the tell that it was disinformation because it came entirely from the wrong source. So the Russians were happy to sit back and watch us chop each other up over this issue and throw a little chum in the water to get things going even more.
And in the end, it looks like they knew that, it's pretty obvious what Steele was looking for when he went over there to Russia. Well, actually, he didn't even go to Russia. He just picked up the phone, maybe. And so they saw it as a conduit, be able to put Russian disinformation directly into the bloodline, right?
Directly. The person supplying that British ex-intelligence officer, Steele, his name was Vyacheslav Trubnikov. He was the old Yuri Andropov. Remember him? The old
Sure.
KGB chairman from... Yeah. He was his main disinformation officer for everything in the English language. He started out in India. So, he was the one who spread the rumor that the AIDS virus was created at a U.S. military lab. So he was the one feeding Steele. Steele was then feeding the FBI through Fusion GPS, and which was paid for by who?
Democratic
By
National
the
Committee.
Democratic
Hillary
National
Clinton.
Committee. Right. So when you have all these things put together, and then I have some friends who are Russian journalists, and they went to that hotel where that supposedly disgusting thing happened. Mm-hmm. I don't know your audience, so I won't try to describe it. But
we won't.
So she went and she interviewed all the maintenance staff at the hotel. I mean, none of them had ever heard of this story, and it's the kind of thing where hotel, housekeepers would certainly know these things. There was no evidence of any of that, and sure enough, it never happened at all. But there were plenty of Russian journalists on their own who went out and investigated and said, this stuff's garbage. Now you look back, Chris, and you're finding the documents that are coming out now from the FBI are showing that the FBI leadership, Director James Comey, his deputy McCabe, his counterespionage chief Peter Strzok, they knew at the time that it was Russian disinformation. And that's the only thing that they didn't leak to the press.
And they used it to get a FISA warrant to spy on a presidential campaign. Well, Dr. Waller, we're up against a break here, so we're going to let you go. But I really want to say I really appreciate it. I hope we can get you on again. And I know you're very busy, but really I've admired you for decades, and your work is so important. And I'm glad we had an opportunity to bring you to my listeners, and they can go to what's the best websites where they can look at more of your information, sir?
Well, our organization went at the Center for Security Policy. It's securefreedom.org. securefreedom.org. Thank you so much, sir. Be healthy in this crazy time that we're living in, and we look forward to speaking to you soon in the future. Thanks,
Thank you so
Chris.
much. All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.